At her sister-in-law's wedding, a profound humiliation engulfed her the instant she stepped into the venue. While others reclined at tables adorned with white silk, their champagne glasses clinking beneath sparkling chandeliers, she was relegated to a spot beside the restroom door, as if she were an unwelcome hindrance to be concealed. The initial sting was sharp, but a deeper wound soon followed. Her mother-in-law leaned in, her smile a cruel twist, her words laced with venom. "If you vanished tomorrow, no one would even notice." Then came the laughter, ruthless, merciless laughter. Her sister-in-law threw her head back in amusement, her father-in-law smirked, and even her own husband chuckled, raising his glass as if it were the most comedic spectacle he'd ever witnessed. In that precise moment, the last thread of her endurance snapped. She neither wept nor pleaded for respect. Instead, she lifted her wine glass, met her mother-in-law's gaze unflinchingly, and whispered, "Challenge accepted." That very night, she departed without a word, without explanation, effectively vanishing from their seemingly perfect existence. For 5 long years, they ridiculed her, convinced she was permanently gone. However, the truth was, she was meticulously building a new foundation, steadily rising. And when their empire began its inevitable collapse, when desperation compelled them to seek her out, the woman they once deemed invisible, she delivered her chilling, definitive reply. "To me, you are nothing." This was not mere vengeance, it was justice. By the time it was all over, they would fully grasp how she had forged their cruelty into the very weapon that dismantled them. Elizabeth Carter, then 34 years old, had once harbored the belief that marrying into the Caldwell family would grant her entry into a life of belonging and respect. A gifted graphic designer, she had diligently built her career through unwavering persistence and innate talent before her marriage had subtly, yet effectively, distanced her from her true self. Having been raised by a single mother who consistently urged her to stand tall in a world intent on diminishing her, Liz possessed both a quiet resilience and a profound yearning for acceptance. It was with this fragile hope that she attended her sister-in-law Caroline's lavish wedding. The Caldwell wedding was an event destined for the society pages, hosted in one of New York City's most exclusive hotels, with over 300 guests representing prominent business circles, charitable foundations, and elite social registers. The ballroom shimmered with the soft glow of candlelight, white roses ascended delicate crystal vases, and the harmonious strains of a live jazz quartet drifted effortlessly through the air. Waiters in impeccable uniforms moved gracefully between tables, expertly balancing trays laden with champagne flutes. It was, in every sense, a display of opulence, influence, and familial pride. Liz entered, poised in her carefully chosen dress, her posture erect, her smile practiced, desperately willing herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, tonight she would not feel like an outsider. Her aspirations crumbled the instant she reached her designated table. Her place card was not positioned among the central tables near the bride and groom, but rather at a small, round table pressed against the wall, adjacent to the restroom entrance. Guests, as they passed by, cast fleeting glances. Some whispered, others barely concealed their amusement. It was utterly impossible to overlook the deliberate slight. She stood there momentarily, clutching her clutch bag tightly, the sting of humiliation already a raw wound. A couple of old acquaintances from her college days spotted her, offering a look that blended pity with discomfort, before quickly rejoining their conversations. Liz settled into her seat, her back stiff, her face composed in an expression of quiet determination, though internally her stomach churned with shame as the festive laughter and chatter swelled throughout the room. Her thoughts drifted back to a cherished memory of her late mother, years ago in their humble kitchen, flour dusting her hands, uttering words that had resonated with her since childhood. "Don't let anyone dim your worth, Lizzie. Even if they try, You hold on to your own light." That echo of maternal wisdom momentarily steadied her racing heart. She lifted her gaze, reminding herself to maintain her composure. Yet the evening was far from finished with its torment. As the main course was served, and the gentle clinking of silverware accompanied hushed conversations, Margaret Caldwell, Liz's mother-in-law, leaned forward from her seat at the adjacent table, her voice, sharp and cold, effortlessly cutting through the table's soft laughter. "If you disappeared tomorrow," Margaret declared with a mocking smile, "no one would even notice." The words sliced through Liz like shards of glass. A ripple of amusement quickly spread, erupting into laughter around the table. Some guests chuckled politely, while others threw back their heads in open merriment. Daniel, her own husband, managed a nervous laugh, as if compelled to participate, unwilling to risk being the sole Caldwell who did not find the cruelty amusing. In that moment, the room seemed to spin. Liz felt a hot flush creep up her face, while her hands grew icy. Her vision narrowed, focusing solely on Margaret's satisfied smirk and Daniel's betraying laughter. She had endured years of condescension, correction, and dismissal, but this was different. This was not a private slight easily forgotten later. This was a deliberate, public declaration that she was invisible, irrelevant, unnecessary. The sting was not just in the words themselves, but in the validation they received from every chuckle, every smile at her expense. For a fleeting moment, tears threatened to surface. Her eyes glistened, yet she staunchly refused to let them fall. She would not grant them the satisfaction of witnessing her brokenness. Instead, she composed herself, reached for the wine glass before her, and lifted it slowly. The deliberate motion captured attention. The laughter around the table subsided, replaced by a collective curiosity. Liz met Margaret's gaze directly, her voice calm and deliberate, carrying clearly across the polished tablecloth. "Challenge accepted." The words hung in the air, weighted with the gravity of a solemn vow. A brief, awkward, and heavy silence followed. Margaret's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Daniel glanced uneasily between his wife and his mother, suddenly uncertain of what had just transpired. A few guests shifted in their chairs, now questioning whether they had witnessed a mere joke or a profound declaration. Then the ambient noise of the ballroom resumed, swallowing the moment. But for Liz, nothing would ever be the same. She excused herself shortly thereafter, citing fatigue. As she navigated the grand hallway, adorned with gilded mirrors and marble columns, she entered the restroom. The muffled music from the ballroom faintly vibrated through the walls while she stood before the mirror. Her reflection stared back, her face still flushed, her lips pressed tightly, her eyes now gleaming, not with tears, but with a sharp, steely resolve. She no longer perceived a humiliated woman. She saw a woman on the precipice of transformation. The insult had done more than sting. It had reawakened something that had lain dormant for too long. Liz placed her hands firmly on the sink, leaned closer to her reflection, and inhaled deeply. The humiliation still burned, but beneath it, an ember of resolve glowed brighter than ever. She straightened her shoulders, dabbed the corners of her eyes with a tissue, and stepped back. The woman who had entered the wedding hoping for acceptance had not survived the evening. The woman who emerged carried something new, a cold, silent vow. And so, the night of Caroline's grand wedding concluded not only with flowers and champagne, but with a quiet, unseen declaration that would irrevocably alter lives. While the Caldwells toasted their facade of unity and perfection, Elizabeth Carter departed the ballroom, her heels clicking steadily across the marble floor, her heart burdened with the weight of a promise no one else comprehended. In her mind, her mother's words resonated once more, but this time they merged with her own burgeoning resolve. She would not allow herself to be invisible. They had scoffed at the mere idea of her disappearing. Soon enough, they would truly discover the profound implications of her actual vanishing act. Elizabeth slipped away from the wedding reception before anyone truly noticed her absence. The music played on, the champagne continued to flow, and the Caldwells maintained their theatrical display of wealth and elegance. Yet, in the quiet solitude of her own home later that night, she already understood the choice she had made. She would no longer linger in the shadows of individuals who thrived on her silence. The house Daniel had selected for them, immaculate and filled with expensive furnishings chosen by his mother's decorator, held no allure for Liz. She surveyed her surroundings and felt no connection. The artwork adorning the walls, the polished china, the rugs imported from Europe, none of it reflected her essence. None of it truly belonged to her. She entered the bedroom, opened the closet doors, and gazed at rows of dresses Margaret had once praised as befitting a Caldwell wife. For the first time, she felt no compulsion to wear them again. Instead, she reached for a small box she had kept carefully tucked away on the top shelf. Inside were the only items that truly mattered: her passport and birth certificate, a laptop brimming with years of design work she had meticulously built before her marriage, and a simple silver necklace, the final gift from her beloved mother. Everything else could remain. She moved quietly, methodically, neither rushing nor hesitating. She slipped the documents into a plain bag, carefully wrapped the necklace around her wrist to ensure it wouldn't be lost, and placed the laptop on top. She left behind jewellery boxes overflowing with diamonds Daniel had bought, the gowns she had been expected to wear at his corporate dinners, and even the shoes she had once cherished. These possessions were never truly meant for her. They had been chosen to fit the image of the Caldwell family, not the woman she genuinely was. On the desk near the window, a framed photograph of their wedding day stared back at her. She studied it for a moment, observing the hopeful young bride she had once been, and the smiling groom who had promised partnership, but delivered only conditional acceptance. She lifted the frame, removed the photograph, and carried it into the kitchen. With steady hands, she struck a match and set the picture ablaze over the sink. The flame consumed the edges, blackening the smiles and reducing the memory to ashes. As it burned, she whispered, "I release this." The photograph disintegrated, its ashes swept down the drain, and with it, the burden of the years she had relinquished. She settled at the dining table, unfolded a pristine sheet of paper, and composed her conclusive message to Daniel. The note was neither verbose nor overtly emotional. She harboured no desire to offer explanations to someone who had unequivocally demonstrated his allegiances. In resolute script, she penned, "Do not seek me. You have already made your choice." She tucked the message beneath his cufflink box, certain he would discover it come morning, and folded it without appending a signature. By the stroke of midnight, Liz was prepared. She slipped into a pair of jeans, a simple sweater, and comfortable shoes, attire she had favoured long before the Caldwell name had enveloped her existence. With a modest bag slung over her shoulder, she stepped into the cool night air. The city's distant hum resonated, indifferent to her departure. She hailed no taxi, contacted no friend. Instead, she embarked on a walk to the bus station, her silver necklace gently tapping against her wrist, each step a resonant reminder of the self she was reclaiming. The station, sparsely populated, resonated with the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. She purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle, a city sufficiently distant to foster a new beginning, yet close enough to preserve the cherished memory of her mother within her heart. When the bus arrived, its headlights piercing the dark, she boarded without a backward glance. She found a window seat and rested her forehead against the glass as the city, once perceived as her home, began to recede into the night. As the bus journeyed along the highway, Liz retrieved her well-worn leather journal. She opened it to a blank page, her fingers trembling slightly, and began to write. The words flowed effortlessly, as if they had patiently awaited this moment of liberation for years. "This is the first freedom in years," she wrote. She firmly underlined the sentence once and closed her eyes. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a lightness settled in her chest. Outside, the night passed by, bridges, street lights, and the occasional passing car. Each mile distancing her from New York was a mile bringing her closer to her true self. She acknowledged the imminent challenges, hardship, loneliness, and uncertainty. Yet, she also understood that remaining in a life where she was invisible posed the greatest risk of all. Back in the hotel ballroom, the Caldwell family continued their celebration. Margaret glided gracefully among guests, recounting anecdotes and accepting accolades. Caroline shared laughter with her friends, basking in the joy of her recent marriage. Daniel, holding a glass of whiskey, smiled, embodying the role of the devoted son and brother. However, amidst the swirling laughter, a fleeting shadow of apprehension crossed his face. He glanced towards the entrance, once, then again, as if anticipating someone who would not return. He mustered another smile, concealing the quiet realization at the back of his mind that something had irrevocably shifted. While the music swelled and the chandeliers glittered above them, Elizabeth Carter sat on a bus destined for Seattle. The ashes of her wedding photo remained behind, her mother's necklace warmed her skin, and the resolve of a woman who had chosen herself for the first time in years enveloped her. The bus carried her through the night, and by morning, Elizabeth stepped into a different world. Seattle's air was cool and damp, the sky a dense grey, seemingly endless. She pulled her small bag down uneven sidewalks until she discovered a modest boarding house on the city's periphery. The room she rented was little more than a box, peeling paint on the walls, a single window draped with a thin curtain, and a bed that sagged in the middle. Yet it was hers. For the first time in years, she closed the door behind her and felt the silence belonged only to her. Life quickly distilled itself down to mere survival. By daybreak, she rose to work at a modest neighborhood cafe, serving steaming cups of coffee to commuters hurrying to their offices. The uniform was unassuming. Her hands carried the constant scent of roasted beans, and her feet ached after hours spent on the floor. When evening fell, she cleaned offices in downtown buildings, pushing a mop across endless linoleum floors until her arms trembled. More than once, she found herself clutching the mop handle so tightly her hands shook. The sheer physical exhaustion bore down on her like an unshakable weight. Yet, she persevered. One evening, after completing a lengthy shift, she stood before the cracked mirror in her rented room. The reflection staring back seemed almost alien. Pale skin, hollow eyes, and hair pulled into a rough knot. She barely resembled the refined wife who had once politely smiled at Caldwell gatherings. For a moment, the sight nearly broke her. She sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, scrolling through old messages she had never deleted. Her thumb hovered over a particular one. It was from Margaret, sent months earlier during an argument about holiday plans. "You were never one of us," the words glowed on the small screen, searing themselves into her chest. For a long moment she allowed them to wash over her, and then, instead of crushing her spirit, they ignited something within her. If she was never truly meant to belong, then she would forge a place where she genuinely did. At the cafe, Elizabeth met Mary, a woman in her late 50s who handled the morning shifts with quiet resilience. Mary possessed a laugh that resonated even on the most challenging days, and though her hands were calloused from years of labour, her presence infused a warmth into the cramped back room. One morning, noticing Liz slumping against the counter from fatigue, Mary leaned in and spoke softly. "You remind me of myself years ago," she said. "I went through a divorce after 30 years of marriage. Lost the house, lost the friends I thought I had. I thought it was the end of me. But it wasn't. It was the beginning." Liz met her eyes, searching for truth in them. Mary gave a slight nod, as if imparting a secret forged through adversity. "Sometimes you lose everything to find yourself." Those words resonated with Liz long after the cafe had quieted for the day. That night, she reopened her journal. The pages had begun to fill with fragments of her thoughts, snippets of memories of her mother, and sketches of design ideas she hadn't touched in years. She wrote about the profound loneliness of entering a room where no one knew her name. She wrote about missing the comfort of her mother's voice, missing the reassuring certainty of a place where she was loved unconditionally. Yet, even as the ache spread across the page, she concluded her entry with unwavering resolve. "I can't go back. I must be reborn." She closed the book firmly, holding it to her chest as if the words contained within could anchor her against the surging tide. Days stretched into weeks. The relentless cycle of survival persisted. But beneath it, a small flame of determination began to flicker. One particular evening, a storm rolled in. Rain lashed against the city with unrelenting force, drenching streets and sending most people scurrying for cover. Elizabeth walked home without an umbrella, her thin coat clinging to her skin, her shoes heavy with water. She paused in the middle of the sidewalk, rain streaming down her face, and tilted her head back toward the sky. For the first time in months, she let out a raw, surprising laugh that burst from her chest. She stood there, drenched and shivering, but smiling. The storm washed over her like a baptism, rinsing away the shame of the past and leaving behind only the promise of something nascent. When she finally reached her small room, she peeled off her wet clothes, wrapped herself in a blanket, and sat by the window, watching the rain continue to fall. The city lights blurred in the water streaks on the glass, and she whispered to herself, "This is my beginning." The words were soft, yet they carried the weight of an oath. She had been humiliated, she had been diminished, and she had been discarded. Yet here, in the solitude of a rented room and the cold embrace of a storm, Elizabeth Carter discovered the genesis of her rebirth. The storm that had soaked Elizabeth left more than just water clinging to her skin. It left an unusual sense of clarity. The following morning, she returned to the cafe, her hair still damp and her shoes still drying by the heater in her small room. She started her shift as she always did, moving efficiently behind the counter. But something in her demeanor had shifted. She no longer moved like someone merely enduring the hours. There was a faint, yet unmistakable spark within her that hadn't been there before. One quiet afternoon, the manager inquired if anyone could assist with redesigning the cafe's outdated menu board. The chalk letters had been smudged too often, and the laminated paper menus were worn. Elizabeth hesitated, then volunteered to try. She retrieved her old laptop during her break and began sketching. By the end of the day, she had produced a clean, contemporary design with hand-drawn accents that captured the cafe's cozy charm. The manager taped it up behind the counter, and customers immediately praised its fresh appearance. One regular even inquired, "Who designed this? It makes the place feel alive." The praise ignited a warmth in her chest. She had nearly forgotten the satisfaction of seeing her craft acknowledged. Among the customers that week was Eleanor Marshall. At 60, Eleanor was the kind of woman who commanded attention, even in silence. She carried herself with quiet authority, her silver-streaked hair neatly pinned, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing. Eleanor had built her own business from the ground up after leaving a marriage that had nearly ruined her financially and emotionally. She recognized the look of someone clawing their way back from the brink. And when she observed Elizabeth behind the counter, she saw it clearly. Eleanor lingered after placing her coffee order, her attention drawn to the newly designed menu. "Did you create that?" she asked casually, pointing to the board. Elizabeth blushed slightly but confirmed, "Yes, just something I put together for the cafe." Eleanor observed her for a moment before offering the faintest smile. "It's more than just something. You possess a keen eye. Meet me after your shift. I might have an opportunity for you." Elizabeth's heart rate quickened, though she strove for composure. That evening, the two women settled at a small corner table, steam rising from their mugs. Eleanor explained her work with several local startups, providing guidance and occasional funding. One particular startup required a logo, and Eleanor believed Elizabeth was capable of the task. "It won't pay much," Eleanor cautioned, "but it's real work, with actual clients. Consider it a test." Elizabeth agreed, a cocktail of gratitude and nerves swirling within her. The following week, Elizabeth presented her initial draft. Eleanor reviewed it in silence, then put it aside. "It's good," she stated, "but it's safe. It appears you're attempting to create what you anticipate they want, rather than what only you can offer. If you aspire to grow, you must cease concealing yourself behind expectations. Each week, I want to see one piece that is uniquely yours. Not for me, not for them. Yours." The words resonated deeply. Elizabeth realized she had spent years conforming to the Caldwell mold, both professionally and personally. She had nearly lost the part of herself that once designed without fear of judgment. That night, she opened her sketchbook and allowed her hand to move freely. Lines evolved into shapes, shapes transformed into designs. Each stroke was guided by buried memories. She drew inspiration from the small silver necklace her mother had given her, from the comforting warmth of their old kitchen, from the laughter she recalled before life became complicated. The drawings were imperfect, but they were authentically hers. Week after week, Elizabeth met Eleanor with new pages. At times, Eleanor was direct, highlighting weaknesses or pushing her harder, yet encouragement always underscored her firmness. Elizabeth began to anticipate these meetings, not for approval, but because they reminded her that her voice was still worth hearing. She had someone who believed in her ascent, even when she doubted herself. One evening, Eleanor invited her to Starbucks, insisting on a change of scenery. They sat by the window, watching the rain streak the glass, while Eleanor sipped her latte and scrutinized Elizabeth's latest sketches. After a prolonged silence, she looked up and reached across the table, her hand resting gently on Elizabeth's. "You have potential," she said, her voice both strong and comforting. "But you cannot rise if you continue to bear the burden of anger. Release it. Let it fuel you for a moment, but do not let it possess you. You have already endured more than most. Now it is time to truly live." Elizabeth swallowed hard, struggling against the lump in her throat. For so long she had worn resentment like armor, convinced it was her only source of strength. Hearing Eleanor speak with such conviction felt like hearing her mother again, a reminder of truths she had almost forgotten. She nodded slowly, and Eleanor offered a brief but firm embrace, an unspoken affirmation that conveyed more than words ever could. That night, Elizabeth returned to her room and arranged her sketches across the bed. For the first time, she did not see only remnants of the past or fragments of pain. She saw beginnings, the faint outline of a life she might genuinely claim for herself. The flame within her, once ignited by humiliation and defiance, was now fanned by something more potent: belief. Elizabeth's sketches began to transcend mere practice. One afternoon, a small restaurant owner entered the cafe where she still worked part-time and struck up a conversation after observing her doodling in her notebook during a break. He mentioned that his family-owned diner had struggled to distinguish itself, that their menus and signage felt antiquated. Elizabeth initially hesitated, but when she finally agreed to design something for him, she immersed herself in the project. Within days, she had created a fresh menu layout with warm colours that echoed the diner's history. When she presented it, the owner studied the pages for a long moment before his voice cracked with emotion. "This design captures our soul," he declared. "It feels like us again." The words filled Elizabeth with a quiet pride she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't about money or recognition. It was about being acknowledged for her genuine talent. Word spread gradually. A neighborhood bookstore contacted her next, requesting a logo and signage that reflected their identity as a community hub. Elizabeth dedicated herself to the work, staying up late at her small desk with only a lamp for company. Hours vanished as she adjusted fonts, experimented with colours and refined images. She barely noticed her fatigue. Instead, her eyes glowed with a fire that had been absent for too long. Occasionally, she would pause, leaning back in her chair to survey her progress, and whisper to herself, "I'm still here." Eleanor also observed the transformation in her. Over coffee, she reminded Elizabeth that talent alone was insufficient. In business, people must be aware of your existence. Your work can be brilliant, but if no one sees it, it won't matter. You need to learn to step into rooms where opportunities reside. She began taking Elizabeth to local networking events, farmers markets where vendors sought packaging, business meetups in community centres, and even small trade fairs. Initially, Elizabeth stood quietly in the background, unsure how to introduce herself, but Eleanor gently prompted her each time. "Speak about your work," she whispered. "You're not asking for favours, you're offering value." With every new handshake, Elizabeth's confidence expanded. She began to perceive that her story resonated with others, particularly small business owners who felt overlooked by larger design firms. Her humility and dedication appealed to them. One weekend at a local business fair, she exchanged cards with half a dozen vendors, and within weeks, 2 had hired her for projects. It was not glamorous work, but each assignment added another stone to the foundation she was constructing. She also discovered community in unexpected places. Encouraged by Eleanor, she joined a women's entrepreneurship group in Seattle. At her first meeting, she was nervous, but quickly realized the room was filled with women who had faced struggles not unlike her own. They shared stories of bankruptcies, of starting anew after divorce, of balancing children and ambition. Listening to them, Elizabeth felt, for the first time, not alone in her struggle. These women did not judge her for her origins or those she had left behind. They simply viewed her as another fighter. Over time, these meetings became a source of energy, each conversation a reminder that rebuilding was possible and even honourable. As Elizabeth's confidence grew, she permitted herself a small indulgence. She walked into a jewellery shop one evening after completing a project and saw a simple yet elegant silver necklace displayed under the glass. It reminded her of the piece her mother had given her, the one she always carried as a reminder of her roots. But this time, it wasn't about memory. This necklace was about the woman she was becoming. She bought it without hesitation, her hands steady as she fastened it around her neck in the shop's mirror. The reflection staring back was no longer the hollow-eyed woman who had silently scrubbed office floors. She saw someone beginning to ascend, step by step. When she returned to her small room that night, she carefully placed the necklace beside her journal. It shimmered faintly in the light of her desk lamp as she resumed work on another client project. And for the first time, Elizabeth didn't feel like she was merely surviving. She was building. The exhaustion was still present, but it was different now. It was the kind of tiredness that followed meaningful effort. She fell asleep with sketches spread across her desk, her new necklace resting against her collarbone, and a sense that her life, once stripped bare, was finally beginning to flourish again. Richard Caldwell had built his company on confidence and control, yet cracks in that facade began to appear sooner than anticipated. Caldwell Inc., once considered a stronghold in the marketing world, made a series of reckless investments in tech startups that promised swift returns but delivered only significant losses. Quarterly reports revealed deficits too vast to conceal. Whispers circulated among shareholders, and by summer, the company was compelled to lay off dozens of employees. For a family that prided itself on prestige and stability, the news was a humiliation. The layoffs resonated through the city, former staff speaking bitterly of being discarded by a company that had once boasted of loyalty and tradition. Caroline, Elizabeth's sister-in-law, whose wedding had once been the epitome of family displays, found herself under a different kind of scrutiny. Her extravagant lifestyle, designer clothes, luxury vacations, A constant stream of curated images on social media caught up to her. A story broke in the New York Post about an affair with a married hedge fund manager, accompanied by grainy photographs of late-night meetings in hotel lobbies. What might once have been dismissed as gossip now gained traction, fueled by the Caldwell name. The scandal spread rapidly, and at the family's golf club, whispers followed her from table to table. The same people who once lined up to commend her taste now lowered their voices, reveling in her downfall as a sport. Margaret, the matriarch, had always orchestrated their public image, ensuring the Caldwell name remained synonymous with refinement. Yet, she too sensed her foundation crumbling. Invitations that had once arrived with unwavering regularity, gala dinners, charity fundraisers, exclusive luncheons, began to dwindle. She first noted their absence in her mailbox, then in her calendar, and ultimately in the sympathetic gazes of acquaintances who would pass her in the market without pausing for a conversation. This decline was subtle initially, then impossible to ignore. For a woman whose existence revolved around status and influence, this exclusion inflicted a wound far deeper than any public insult. Daniel, concurrently, grappled with his own silent turmoil. He immersed himself in his work, but the financial figures stubbornly refused to improve. Late one evening, he sat in his office, staring at an email draft addressed to Elizabeth. He meticulously crafted and redrafted the opening lines, struggling to find words that didn't sound utterly hollow. Finally, he typed, "I know I laughed when I shouldn't have. I know I failed you. I'm sorry." His finger hesitated over the send button before he compelled himself to press it. Hours passed, then days. The reply never materialized. He checked his inbox compulsively, but silence was his only answer, a silence that resonated louder than any reprimand. The strain within the Caldwell household escalated. At one dinner, Richard slammed his fist onto the table, causing the silverware to rattle. His voice was low but sharp, a potent blend of anger and desperation. "We're cracking, but we'll fix it," he declared. His words carried the weight of authority, yet even he could detect the underlying tension. His children averted his gaze. Margaret discreetly dabbed her lips with her napkin in a futile attempt to maintain composure, and Daniel sat in silence, the unsent email replaying endlessly in his mind. Miles away in Seattle, Elizabeth sat at her desk, surrounded by sketches and client projects. A sliver of evening sunlight streamed across her workspace as she leaned back in her chair, sipping from a chipped coffee mug. Her phone vibrated with another inquiry for design work, and she smiled quietly to herself. The world she had left behind was unraveling, but she no longer felt emotionally connected to it. The image of the Caldwells clinging to their pride, even as it slipped from their grasp, stood in stark contrast to her own modest yet steady ascent. She allowed herself a singular thought before returning to work. Perhaps justice didn't always necessitate active intervention. Sometimes it simply unfolded on its own. Elizabeth's transformation wasn't an abrupt event, but once it manifested, it was unmistakable. One tranquil morning, she stood before the mirror in a Seattle salon. When the stylist inquired about her desired look, Elizabeth responded with a calm certainty she hadn't experienced in years. "Short, clean, something that shows I'm not hiding anymore." As the scissors went to work, long strands of hair fell away, collecting on the floor like remnants of her former self. When the mirror revealed a sharp bob that framed her face, paired with a modern blazer and dark jeans she had chosen for the occasion, she barely recognized the woman staring back. This wasn't the subdued Caldwell wife. This was someone new, someone distinctly her. Her vocational endeavors had grown well beyond mere odd jobs and freelance commissions. With Eleanor's guidance and her own tireless dedication, Elizabeth signed the lease for a modest office in downtown Seattle. The space was small, 2 rooms with tall windows and scuffed floors, but it was unequivocally hers. On the glass door, freshly painted letters declared, "Carter Design Studio." The first day she sat behind her new desk, she ran her hand over the worn wooden surface and allowed herself a quiet smile. This was more than just survival. This was ownership, independence, the resurgence of the dream she had once buried. Her reputation began to extend beyond the local community. A branding project for a food company was featured in a regional magazine, and soon after, an invitation arrived. She had been requested to speak at a creative conference, a gathering of designers, entrepreneurs, and innovators. The letter made her chest tighten with anticipation. Once, she would have doubted her place in such an esteemed environment. Now, she knew she had earned it. She meticulously prepared her talk, not only on design, but also on resilience, on rediscovering one's voice after periods of silence. While Elizabeth's star began its ascent, Daniel Caldwell's began to wane. The very newspapers that once lauded the Caldwell name now turned against him. A high-profile deal he had championed collapsed spectacularly, costing the company millions. The New York Post ran a headline that stung more acutely than any financial loss: "The weak heir." His photograph appeared beneath it, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. For a man raised with the expectation of dominance, the humiliation was brutal. In his office, the silence following calls with furious board members grew heavier with each passing day. He scrolled through articles praising emerging firms, one of which bore the name Carter Design Studio. Elizabeth observed the stark contrast, but she felt no hint of gloating. One evening, she sat at her desk, her journal open beside her lamp. She wrote with a steady hand, "Revenge is not needed. Living free is enough." The words settled on the page like a definitive truth. She didn't need to punish the Caldwells. Their own arrogance was accomplishing that. Her singular task was to live fully. The night of the conference, Elizabeth stood backstage, her hands composed at her sides. She wore her new look with quiet pride. The cropped hair, the fitted blazer, the polished jeans that perfectly balanced professionalism and individuality. When her name was announced, she stepped into the glow of the spotlight. The audience quieted, hundreds of faces turning towards her. For a fleeting moment, she recalled the humiliation at Caroline's wedding, the sting of laughter at her expense. Then she raised her chin, met the light head-on, and began to speak. The stage illuminated her as if the world itself was acknowledging her rebirth. Each word she delivered conveyed not just her expertise, but the story of a woman who had chosen to rise from invisibility. In that moment, Elizabeth Carter was no longer someone who had once disappeared. She was someone who had returned stronger, untouchable, and entirely her own. The creative conference in Seattle vibrated with a concentrated energy that Elizabeth had previously only observed from a distance. Towering banners unfurled and settled in the air-conditioned environment, displaying the names of sponsors and speakers, while clusters of attendees drifted between booths, lanyards swaying against their impeccably pressed shirts. She adjusted the miniature microphone clipped to her blazer and felt a familiar tranquility settle in her chest. The same composure that had sustained her through countless late nights of work and the quiet mornings of fresh beginnings. She had undeniably earned her place on that illustrious stage. Her name was emblazoned in bold on the program as the keynote speaker, and while this realization felt astonishing, it also resonated with an undeniable truth. Among the hundreds filtering into the auditorium, one man sat so rigidly he appeared to be sculpted from the chair itself. Daniel Caldwell had traveled to the event under considerable pressure from his board to be visible and reconnect, phrases that now held little meaning for him as the financial indicators continued their downward trend. He absently flipped through the program's pages until his gaze landed on her name, at which point the papers in his hands became motionless. When the lights dimmed and Elizabeth stepped into the spotlight circle, the shock that coursed through him was almost palpable. He had anticipated a changed person. He had not anticipated this. Elizabeth commenced her address without any pretense or theatrics. She spoke of design that genuinely serves people, of the art of listening until a brand inherently speaks for itself, and of the process of rebuilding one's work much like rebuilding a life, carefully, humbly, with the patience required to discard what is false. Her voice resonated evenly throughout the expansive room, unhurried and entirely self-assured. Each thoughtfully articulated phrase prompted heads to lift and pens to meet paper. She navigated through compelling case studies and practical frameworks, and even questions that might have flustered her in a different phase of her life now found her poised and prepared. She responded with precise clarity and with a light in her eyes that betrayed not only remarkable competence, but also unwavering conviction. From his seat, Daniel observed the audience's reaction. Diligent note-taking, frequent nodding, that soft murmur of approval that often precedes thunderous applause. He vividly recalled a moment, long ago, at a table, where he had laughed while a cruel sentence hung between his mother and his wife like a sharpened blade. He felt the echo of that profound shame now, the exact instant he had diminished himself in his own estimation. He struggled to maintain a steady breath as her concluding line resonated through the room, and the applause surged. It wasn't merely a polite ovation, it was born of genuine gratitude. As the session concluded, attendees formed lines at the foot of the stage to express their thanks, to exchange business cards, and to request a mere 5 minutes of her time at a later date. Elizabeth listened attentively, shook hands graciously, and jotted down a few notes on her own card before handing it to an eager attendee with a brief promise to follow up. She was in no rush. There was no need to be. The room adjusted to her measured pace. Daniel rose and made his way down the aisle, patiently waiting for others to finish their interactions. He caught snippets of conversation as he drifted closer. "Your framework saved us 3 months. The clarity you've brought to the process. We followed your studio's work for a while." Each scrap of praise fortified the quiet barrier he would soon have to cross to address her. He paused when she stepped from the stage and into a side corridor with an event coordinator. Then, he finally found his voice. "Liz," he uttered, and that single syllable carried the weight of a decade. She turned, her face composed, her posture relaxed, as if the intense demands of the past hour had taken absolutely nothing from her. For a fleeting heartbeat, they simply regarded one another, the muted murmur of the corridor's activity flowing around them like water around a stone. "I need a moment," he stated to the coordinator, who promptly stepped back. Daniel now faced Elizabeth directly, words piling up within him and then spilling out faster than he had intended. "I'm sorry. I should have said it the day you left. I should have said it the night I laughed when I should have stood beside you. You're the love of my life. I lost sight of that. Please, Liz, return. We can rectify this. I can rectify it." The corridor appeared to narrow. Her expression remained unchanged, neither softening nor hardening. Instead, it settled into an unyielding clarity. She exhaled a breath between them, and her subsequent words, though not loud, carried absolute finality. "You laughed that day." That sufficed. The pronouncement struck with the sharp clarity of truth. He blinked, as if a sudden, brilliant light had momentarily blinded him. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened once more. He instinctively reached out, a gesture half formed by habit and remorse, before letting his hand drop. Any plea he had rehearsed dissolved under the immense weight of an irreversible past. Elizabeth inclined her head slightly, a gesture requiring no interpretation, and moved past him. The conference's general hum resumed as the hallway opened into the spacious lobby, where exhibitors conversed beneath hanging banners, and the espresso machine steadily hissed from a corner cart. She maintained her steady stride. Each step away felt less like an escape and more like a return to equilibrium. Outside, a slender sunbeam pierced through layers of clouds, silvering the building edges. She paused near the glass doors, allowing the cooler air to dispel the lingering warmth from the stage lights. Then, She retrieved her phone and dialed the one person who had taught her that personal growth is a discipline, not a miraculous occurrence. Eleanor answered on the second ring. "How did it go?" "It's concluded," Elizabeth stated. "Better than I could have imagined. And I saw him." A pause followed, filled with unspoken understanding. "And I finally put that chapter behind me." The sentence landed with the quiet significance of a door securely locked. No bitterness clung to it, no tremor of yearning, only a sense of completion. "I'm proud of you," Eleanor responded. "Now, go drink some water. Afterward, sit with those who genuinely wish to hear your ideas." Elizabeth smiled, even though no one was present to witness it. She slipped her phone back into her bag and glanced at the badge on her lapel, bearing her name and the studio's imprint. Attendees continued to filter past, many stopping to express their appreciation for her presentation. She thanked them, scheduled future connections, and made her way toward the small cafe stand to order tea. Behind her, in the dimly lit corridor, Daniel remained motionless for a prolonged minute. People politely but purposefully navigated around him. Ultimately, he turned in the opposite direction, toward a meeting he could no longer afford to miss, carrying the profound realization that regret had arrived too late, after the door had irrevocably shut. The headline that had branded him weak had not stung as deeply as the few simple words that had brought their shared story to an end. Elizabeth cradled the warm cup in her palms, allowing the steam to rise and dissipate into the lobby air. The day continued. Conversations awaited. Work awaited. A life hard-won and entirely her own awaited. She moved toward the light that cut across the polished floor, the conference's sounds enveloping her without burden. The disintegration of the Caldwell Empire did not result from a single catastrophic event, but rather from a relentless series of devastating blows, until the once unassailable family stood exposed before the world. The initial rupture occurred when Caldwell Inc. lost a significant contract that had been publicly hailed as their lifeline. It was a global account, precisely the kind of partnership Richard Caldwell had built his reputation upon, and its sudden termination caused investors to flee. The phones in the New York office rang incessantly, with board members demanding explanations. Yet, the truth was stark. The company teetered on the brink of collapse. Where their name once signified security and dominance, it now served as a synonym for failure. Richard, the patriarch with an iron will, had always been the one to quell crises with his authority. However, both age and illness now betrayed him. A sudden health crisis rendered him bedridden, his once booming voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. For decades, he had commanded boardrooms with unwavering certainty. Now he lay at home, unable to guide his children or stabilize the empire he had meticulously constructed. His absence from leadership was immediately noticeable. Creditors grew restive, and employees whispered that the end was nigh. Without Richard at the helm, Caldwell Inc. drifted aimlessly toward disaster. Caroline, the daughter whose wedding had once epitomized the family's image of success, faced her own public humiliation. Her marriage crumbled under the weight of scandal, and the press swarmed to cover every detail. Headlines declared her divorce a spectacle, dragging her reputation through tabloids and morning shows. The same society pages that had once lauded her designer gowns and glittering parties now published photographs of her leaving courtrooms with hollow eyes. Where she had once basked in admiration, she now endured pity or ridicule. Margaret, who had long prided herself on being the polished hostess and queen of the social circuit, found her invitations drying up completely. At galas, where her laughter once resonated, her absence was barely noted. Younger wives and newer donors occupied the tables where she had previously presided. She clung to her pearls and her posture, but her voice no longer commanded influence in discussions about charities or civic events. She had constructed her world on appearances, and those appearances now betrayed her. crumbling with every whisper that she had lost her Midas touch. Daniel bore the heaviest burden of all. Once expected to inherit and expand the family legacy, he now found himself submerged in debt. The failed ventures, the disastrous deals, the headlines that labelled him the weak heir, each pushed him further into isolation. Creditors hounded him, business partners refused his calls, and the weight of failure pressed upon every hour of his day. He had once envisioned leading the empire to unprecedented heights. Now, he could barely keep his own reputation above water. The family gathered in their grand dining room, but the space felt cavernous, stripped of its former magnificence. Richard's chair remained empty. Margaret's composure began to fray. Caroline stared into her glass with vacant eyes, and Daniel paced the length of the rug. Voices rose and fell until Daniel uttered the unthinkable. "Only Liz can save us." The name hung in the air, simultaneously an accusation and a plea. For a long moment, no one responded. To utter her name was to acknowledge the bridge they had incinerated, the cruelty they had once found amusing against the woman they had dismissed as insignificant. Yet now, in their desperation, she was the sole individual who could transform their ruin into survival. Outside their deteriorating home, the world watched with fascination. Local television stations aired features titled "The Fall of the Caldwell Empire." Reporters interviewed former employees, society acquaintances, and industry experts. Clips of the once golden family were juxtaposed with footage of layoffs, court filings, and public scandals. Viewers shook their heads, some with pity, others with quiet satisfaction. The empire that had once loomed over them was now reduced to a cautionary tale. And somewhere in Seattle, Elizabeth Carter worked late into the evening, the glow of her office light radiant against the skyline. She did not need to see the headlines to know the empire was crumbling. She sensed it in the silence of her inbox, in the absence of messages that might have arrived years earlier. The family that had once told her she was invisible was finally invisible themselves, and the world was taking notice. The Caldwells did not arrive in triumph. They came to Seattle with the muted demeanour of people who had exhausted all other options. Their flight landed before dawn, and a hired car transported them from the airport to a glass tower whose upper floors reflected a pale winter sky. The receptionist on the lobby level requested their names, then made a discreet call upstairs. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, the world they entered bore no resemblance to the corridors they had governed for years. There was no cold marble, no ostentatious displays of wealth, only clean lines, warm wood, framed works from small businesses, logos, packages, storefronts, each a narrative of someone who had been noticed and empowered to stand taller. The profound difference settled over them like a silent indictment. An assistant led them into a conference room with windows overlooking the bay. The table was long, but not intimidating. The chairs were comfortable, yet not extravagant. What subdued them was not the furnishings, but the presence at the head of the table. Elizabeth sat with a tablet before her, a legal pad to one side, a pen meticulously aligned with the pad's edge. She rose when they entered, not to embrace, not to welcome them as family, but with the professional courtesy of someone who understood protocol and commanded the space it dictated. She had become the kind of leader who did not need to demonstrate authority through posture alone. Authority emanated from her. For a moment, no one spoke. Margaret, once the unflappable hostess, appeared smaller than Elizabeth remembered. Her gloves were clutched in one hand. Her pearls clicked softly against each other with a slight tremor in her fingers. Caroline had not come. Richard was too ill to travel. Daniel stood to Margaret's left, his shoulders stooped by fatigue and a worry that had stolen his sleep. The assistant withdrew, the door closed, and the silence solidified into a tangible entity. Elizabeth gestured to the chairs across from her with a single open hand. They sat. She did not meander through pleasantries, did not inquire about their hotel, did not fill the room with the polite filler that eases lesser individuals into difficult conversations. "You requested this meeting," she stated, her voice even. "What do you require?" It was Margaret who broke first. Her breath hitched, and the words emerged as if meticulously rehearsed in the darkness. "Elizabeth, please, for the family." She stood as if to circle the table, then paused, as if remembering a boundary she could not cross without permission. The composure she had cultivated for decades wavered, and then completely failed. Her knees met the carpet. The subdued thud of bone against the floor resonated through the room, its impact undeniable. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, pleaded once more in a tremulous voice. "Please." Daniel leaned forward, his hands pressing against the table as if to anchor himself, or perhaps the precariousness of the moment. "Or both, Liz," he acknowledged, her name sounding both intimately familiar and strangely distant from his lips. "We are family. Help us." His desperate plea stretched between them, a fragile, honest thread, offered far too late. Elizabeth remained silent, her fingers intertwined, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. The atmosphere in the room tightened, bound by the past that had convened them. For her, the distance from this chair to a place card by a restroom door was not a matter of miles, but a tally of choices. The vivid memory of Caroline's wedding flashed before her, clear as a cinematic recall. Pristine white roses, gleaming silverware, a burst of laughter at her expense, the precise, defining cadence of Margaret's words that had assigned her value at that table. She recalled the reassuring weight of her wineglass, the metallic taste in her mouth, the sharp precision of 2 words she'd uttered, like a key turning in a lock. This memory did not wound, it instructed. It served as a stark reminder that this encounter was no random twist of fate, but an inevitable point on a map she had meticulously charted the night she departed. Outside the windows, gulls etched slow, arcing patterns against the bright sky, soaring above the water. A ferry glided towards a distant pier. Inside, not a soul stirred. Even the faint hum of the HVAC system seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's tears carved paths down a face that had long mastered the weaponization of charm, now finding that charm utterly futile. The woman who once dictated seating arrangements and guest lists had discovered that there are rooms where invitations are not begged, but earned. And in this particular room, she was certainly not the hostess. Daniel's eyes scoured Elizabeth's face, searching for a trace of softness, any indication that the woman he once saw adjusting her dress in a mirror before a gala still resided within the composed figure presiding at the head of the table. He found only resolute clarity. Swallowing, he tried again. "I know we don't deserve it, I know. But the company, our employees, so many livelihoods are at stake. If not for us, then for them." This argument was devoid of manipulation. It was the final, desperate plea of a man who had at last grasped the non-negotiable nature of consequences. Elizabeth's silence neither mocked nor taunted him. It merely held the line that had been irrevocably crossed years ago. She sensed Eleanor's counsel, a silent strength at her back, without needing to invoke her name. Let your restraint speak. Let your presence convey what words cannot. She took a single, slow, steady breath, then redirected her attention to Margaret. The older woman's hands were now pressed against the carpet, not to rise, but simply to remain in a posture foreign to her. Nothing within Elizabeth recoiled at the sight. Nothing within her compelled her to lift Margaret up. Mercy and rescue are not the same, she mused, and not all lessons can be purchased with tears. A soft rap at the door preceded the assistant, who opened it just enough to set a tray inside, water glasses, a small carafe of coffee, before quietly withdrawing. The meeting, ostensibly a plea, now revealed its true nature. Not a cry for help, but a calculated maneuver. The Caldwells hadn't merely come to beg for survival. They had come to reassert control. Their words were soft, their tones dripping with feigned humility. Yet, as the documents slid across Elizabeth's table, the truth became inescapably clear. They didn't just want her support. They sought to subsume her company into their failing empire, to absorb what she had meticulously built, and once again cast her into their shadow. It was not mercy they pursued, but control cloaked as reconciliation. Elizabeth's composure remained unshaken. She allowed the papers to lie untouched, her eyes scanning only the signatures, the clauses designed to erode her autonomy. It was the same old narrative, now dressed in desperation. Their empire was crumbling, and they intended to use her as structural support, not as an equal partner. She picked up a folder of her own and opened it with deliberate precision. The Caldwells leaned forward, anticipation in their eyes, until they comprehended what lay before them. It was not an offer, it was evidence. Statements, ledgers, and signed agreements all revealed the same damning fact. Caldwell Inc. owed money, not to banks, not to silent investors, but directly to Carter Design. Elizabeth had become not merely their last resort, but their creditor. The empire that had once dismissed her was already deeply indebted to her. Margaret gasped. Daniel's face paled, his mouth working silently before he stammered. "That can't be right. There must be some mistake." Elizabeth at last reached for her cup, lifting it with unhurried grace, allowing the steam to twist gently in the space between them. She took a single sip, then set it down, her gaze never leaving theirs. "Once," she stated, her voice low yet sharp enough to pierce the silence, "I was nothing to you. Today, your company is nothing to me." The words landed with a greater force than any shout, pressing the room into an uneasy stillness. Before anyone could regain composure, her assistant re-entered with another folder. This one bore the logo of Caldwell's fiercest competitor. Elizabeth flipped to the signature page, uncapped her pen, and signed her name with a steady hand. The scratch of her pen on paper was louder than Margaret's muffled sob. She closed the folder, handed it back, and nodded once. "Effective immediately," she instructed her assistant. "Proceed." Daniel's composure fractured. He leaned forward, his voice cracking. "Liz, wait, please, we can make this right." "We can." His words dissolved as her unwavering gaze swept across the table. She remained silent. She didn't need to speak. Her silence was more devastating than any outright refusal. It carried the accumulated weight of years of neglect, humiliation, and erasure, now returned to them with interest. Daniel's shoulders slumped, his lips still moving soundlessly. A man defeated, not by fury, but by profound indifference. Elizabeth rose. The scrape of her chair against the floor was a deliberate, final pronouncement. She gathered her notes, slid them into her portfolio, and straightened her jacket. She did not look back at Margaret, still kneeling on the carpet, nor at Daniel's pleading face. She walked towards the door with measured steps, each one echoing through the hollow empire they had attempted to wield over her. At the threshold, she paused just long enough for the silence to resettle. In that silence lay her victory, not boisterous or cruel, but utterly undeniable. Then she exited the room, leaving the Caldwells to their demise, undone not by her vengeance, but by their own ingrained arrogance. The sun was sinking towards the horizon when Elizabeth reached the middle of the bridge. The steel and cables stretched majestically above her, the water below shimmering with gold and copper as Seattle's skyline began to ignite with evening lights. She slowed her pace, letting the breeze envelop her, and looked forward. There was no longer a need to glance back. She had borne the burden of that family for far too many years. Tonight, she walked ahead, lighter than she had ever been. Each step across the bridge was a quiet declaration. She was free, and she had forged her own path. The world beyond her already knew what had transpired. News tickers on local television scrolled the headline, "Caldwell Inc. files for bankruptcy." Once a name whispered with reverence at charity galas and embossed on invitations as a hallmark of prestige, it was now reduced to a cautionary tale. Their assets had dwindled, their reputation shattered, their legacy unravelled. Elizabeth had not lifted a finger to bring them down, beyond safeguarding her own. Their collapse was a consequence of their own actions, the final chapter of unbridled arrogance. But while their story concluded, hers seemed to expand limitlessly. Weeks later, Elizabeth stood in a bookstore, picking up the latest issue of Forbes. There, on the glossy cover, was her own face. Her hair, stylishly cropped at her jawline, caught the light. Her eyes, filled with steady confidence, looked directly into the camera. The headline stretched boldly across the page. "The woman who disappeared and came back, unstoppable." She traced the letters with her fingertips, a faint smile playing on her lips. Once she had been told she was invisible. Now the world itself had chosen to see her. Her voice, calm and steady, seemed to echo through the memory of her journey. "I didn't need to destroy them. Their arrogance did that. I only had to disappear and find myself." It was not a triumph laced with bitterness, but a statement of truth uttered without anger. Revenge had transmuted into something far greater, into freedom, into creation. The camera of life did not stop on glossy pages or cold headlines. It ended where her heart had quietly hoped it would, around a dinner table. Eleanor sat to her right, as sharp as ever, her laughter filling the air. Across from her were friends from the women's startup group in Seattle, raising glasses of wine and sharing stories. The table was laden with food, light, and warmth. Elizabeth leaned back, her laughter joining theirs, her smile unguarded and genuine. In their company, she had discovered the family she had once been denied. Not the family that measured worth by bloodlines, wealth, or social standing, but the family that recognized her value without demanding proof. The clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of conversation, the glow of companionship. This was the empire that could not fall. Elizabeth Carter had vanished once, but she had returned, stronger, brighter, utterly untouchable. As twilight descended upon Seattle, she realized with absolute conviction that her vanishing act had been her most impactful maneuver yet.